Today's episode is brought to you by Dorrington Plumbing, Gas and Electrical, and they provide quality-focused specialists for both residential and commercial plumbing, gas and electrical services. They've been doing this since 1995 and have built up a substantial reputation within the sector. If you're interested in these services, head to www.dorringtonplumbing.com.au.
Hello, I'm Ben Kosterich, and this is the Market Bull podcast. Joining me in the studio again, we last spoke about 9 months ago and a lot has happened, but it's Paul Lepinier, the Managing Director of Strickland Metals, which is listed on the ASX under code STK. Now, I will confess I've been a shareholder for a long time as well, so I'll get that out of the way, but welcome back, Paul.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Since we spoke, gold has continued to race away, which is fantastic for anyone in the gold space, but there's been some substantial updates to the company from projects to shareholders coming on board. So if I pull it back, if no one's ever heard of Strickland Metals, how do you best describe what the company is?
We're a very rare opportunity on the ASX. So we're a gold exploration company, but we've got two really high quality assets. The main one being the Rogozna Gold and Base Metals Project in Serbia, and the other one being the Yandal Gold Project here in WA. So one of the largest resource bases out of all the junior gold explorers. We've got 7.4 million ounce gold equivalent resource in Serbia, which is the second largest on the ASX amongst junior companies. And we've also got the 400,000 ounces here in WA. So that's what really sets us apart. That combined with our current war chest of close to $40 million in cash and Northern Star shares, which means we're fully funded to really deliver on our really ambitious sort of growth targets over the next 12 months.
Yeah, it's a fascinating sort of opportunity that, again, it's a company has in your position. But let's pull it back. You were saying, or you announced to the ASX that you had a substantial new player come on board. As an Australian, the name doesn't necessarily instantly jump out at you, but talk to us about the significance of Zijin jumping on board and becoming a strategic partner and shareholder in the company.
Yeah, so Zijin, currently the world's, I think, fourth largest gold or mining company, full stop. Chinese company listed on Hong Kong and Shanghai Stock Exchange, market cap about $60 billion. And so any time you get a large company reaching out, wanting to invest, it's a really positive signal to the market that what you've got is pretty good. They don't invest in many things. They only invest in those sorts of companies with projects that they ideally would like to mine themselves. It was probably more significant for us because Zijin are also the largest mining company currently producing in Serbia, where our Rogozna project is located. So it was really important for us at the time to validate the project and our story. Australian investors aren't overly familiar with sort of big bulk tonnage, porphyry-related projects. So to have Zijin, who mine these projects in Serbia, want to invest in us, that was a really solid tick of approval at the time. And the other thing was pretty important was, given they operate in Serbia, they're currently producing about 300,000 tonnes per annum of copper, 250,000 ounces of gold. So it was also an important tick of approval for Serbia as a jurisdiction. Again, Australian investors aren't overly familiar with Serbia as a jurisdiction. Not many companies listed on the ASX have been operating there. So those two fundamental ticks of approval were really important at a time for us because we'd just come out with two good resource upgrades. We'd taken the resources from 5.4 million ounce gold equivalent last year and then upgraded those to about 7.4 million ounces. So the combination of showing really substantial resource growth just from 6 months of drilling last year and then to back that up with Zijin coming in for actually 2.4% on the register, was really fantastic for the company and our share price has really grown a lot off the back of that over the last couple of months.
Yeah, the resource update, that was another thing that would have been happening in the lead up and since we spoke. For those that are unfamiliar with that, how much of a turning point was that? And I can imagine now there's further steps with drilling programs in Serbia, but how did that really, again, sort of get those conversations started, showing that this is potentially quite a large porphyry system that
Yeah, so if you go
Just
back
locked.
to last year when Strickland acquired this asset from Iberia Capital, it had 5.4 million ounce gold equivalent, but there was also a lot of extra drilling data that had been done by Iberia and previous owners, Eldorado Gold, which showed, several million ounces additional potential. And so it was important because, when the transaction happened, I was fairly confident, we could get to 10 million ounces. So in that first season, off the back of sort of 20 odd thousand metres of drilling, to be able to add 2 million ounces was it was good to sort of show that we weren't just, making things up. And so to deliver that 7.4 million ounces, all of a sudden, I guess a lot of the doubters out there started to think, maybe they are on the right track here. And the other key thing about that resource upgrade, we did that at a cost of about $3 an ounce. And that's pretty much unheard of globally. And that's a combination of two things, really. One is, the obvious geological style of mineralisation, where when we're drilling these things, when you're in the system, we get 300 metres plus of continuous mineralisation, including multiple high-grade zones. So when you've got that style of mineralisation, you can add a lot of ounces really quickly. Medenovats, for example, 1.3 million ounce initial resource, that only needed about 12 holes, of which most of them were done prior to Strickland, so that's how we kind of knew it was there. So very, very rare to have these sorts of projects where you can add ounces at $3 an ounce. The second thing is Serbia is a pretty low-cost environment, particularly compared to Australia. So, our drilling costs, for example, $110 a metre all in. So the combination of the geology plus the low-cost environment means we can get a lot of bang for our buck operating there. So yeah, really important that we delivered on what we said we would. Now we've got visibility towards that 10 million ounce goal, and that's where, at that sort of scale, those projects are very rare globally, and that's really the projects that the majors want. If you sort of benchmark Rogozna against all the other sort of plus 5 million ounce projects globally and look at who owns them, 90% of those projects are owned by majors and mid-tiers. And that's pure, and that is why Zijin invested.
Interesting. So going forward, again, the goal of 10 million feels like that's something that you and the team is probably very, very determined to get to. But what really is required to get there? What are some of the next steps? Is, again, more drilling at certain areas to build up this whole sort of scale, or what's really going through your brain now that we're almost about to head into a new financial year, which means another 12 months of planning?
So yes, to get to the 10 million ounces, we definitely need quite a bit more drilling. We started that off in March, currently in the midst of 50,000 metre drill program this year. Got 6 rigs currently on site. We expect to even increase that further over the next couple of months, probably get up to 8 rigs and really start to push the boundaries on, this project's never done that before, right? It's always been, systematically explored with 2, 3, 4 rigs. We've got 6 now and going to 8. Probably the key for the resource growth this year is the Gradina deposit. So the 7.4 million ounces sits on 3 deposits, Shanat's being the biggest, then Medenovats and Copper Canyon. But Gradina, we've had over 20,000 metres of previous drilling. Gold's been mapped along strike for about 1 kilometre. There's drill intercepts that show it's at least 900 metres vertically high. And, we put some results out last week, 60 odd metres at 3.5 grams gold. And so we know there's a lot of gold in that system. So we're drilling another 20 to 25,000 metres there as we speak. We've got 4 rigs on Gradina at the moment. And the other key thing for Gradina is not only do we know there's a lot of gold there, and it's the most gold rich of all the deposits, but it's actually open towards surface, which is kind of rare. Here in WA, when you do an exploration on flat terrain, you normally hit a deposit relatively shallow and then you chase it down at depth. Well, where we are, it's almost the opposite, and that's because we're in kind of mountainous terrain. So historically, the drilling at Gradina was done from a valley, and when you drilled from that valley on an angle, you hit the deposit at depths ranging from 300 to 900 metres, depending on the angle of the hole. But it had never been drilled sort of above that in the sort of up dip position near surface because that needed an access track to be put in, and that can be time consuming and cost a bit of money. So last year we actually extended the track up the hill, drilled a hole from up there, hit sort of 50 metres at 3 grams gold. And now we're just extending the track further uphill, and that'll be finished in the next month. And then we'll actually be able to drill it near surface. So that can be a real game changer for the project, not just in terms of the potential resource, but in terms of how the deposit could be mined, and therefore that'll affect the whole sequencing of, well, which of these deposits makes the most sense to be the first cab off the rank in terms of a development. Everyone kind of assumes at the moment it's Shanats because it's 5.3 million ounces. It's the biggest, it's got the most optionality. But if we can get Gradina coming quite close to surface, regardless of whether you consider an open pit or underground, the fact that it's the most high-grade gold-only deposit could easily see Gradina overtake Shanats and become that first-stage development.
And validating those drilling, you said there's currently work underway. Those will be coming through to the really investors in the coming weeks and or months, and then extending that track. Does that mean you already have really an idea of when you want to get a drill rig further up that trail and drilling closer to that surface point?
We expect that drill rig, we'll start to be able to drill the up-dip positions probably in the next month at Gradina. And, we've already been tracking it gradually further up, but the ones that are much closer to surface, I'd expect we'd have a rig on that in the next month. And we'll be putting out results now for every couple of weeks, I would expect, for Gradina through to later on in the year, where we're aiming to deliver a sort of maiden resource by December. So, it's exciting times for not just the project, but, specifically the Gradina deposit. In terms of where else do we see resource growth? Well, last year we added about 700,000 ounces at Shanats from about 10 holes. That growth was primarily around, we were successful in identifying some new high-grade zones. Previously, the whole deposit had only been drilled pretty broadly. So, when you've got 80-metre space holes, you can hide a lot of stuff within that. And as we closed that spacing and targeted specific parts of the deposit, as we started to understand it better, we hit a lot of nice high-grade zones, including a new gold zone, which ran about 90 metres at 4 grams. So we expect to get a bit more resource growth out of Shanats this year as well. That mineralisation is totally open as well. So that's the other one. And then probably the third one is Kosterich. We made a really nice discovery since we last spoke last year in around September. This one is only a few hundred metres from Medenovac. So first couple of holes we drilled at Kosterich both hit really nice zones of mineralisation there. And so we're going to drill another 4,000 metres there this year to start scoping out the size of that system. And given it's only 300 metres from Medenovac, we think it'll complement that deposit really well.
I mean, there's a lot going on, and it sort of screens back to that point that you said earlier, which was being in Serbia, potentially not everyone quite understands the significance of this deposit. I can imagine a lot of what you do is about really educating people on the cost of operating there and the quality of this deposits. But why do you think there's almost this disconnect potentially from Australian investors into Serbia and the potential of this gold? Because if this was in Australia, I can imagine it'd be in control of Northern Star or a large-scale gold producer, and there'd be no questions about it. But because it's in a Serbian jurisdiction, there's almost this lack of awareness and or understanding about it. So how do you best sort of bring those people along for the ride to get them up to speed potentially?
Yeah, you're right. So I spend a lot of my time trying to educate the market, and it's not been easy, particularly, when you think of Strickland historically was just a WA-focused gold explorer. So all of the investors prior to July last year had invested in Strickland solely off the back of the Yandal project, typical WA Yilgarn orogenic gold deposit, which WA investors and Australian investors more generally understand quite well because there's 100 companies, if not more, on the ASX that explore those assets. So if you look at just on a weekly basis, the number of companies releasing drill results on a WA gold project, you'd lose track. WA investors, Australian investors understand those sorts of deposits really well. The magmatic style of deposits like Rogozna, porphyry related, big bulk tonnage, lower grade, they're not overly common in Australia. The only really good examples of stuff like Cadia Ridgeway in New South Wales. Certainly none in WA. Probably the closest thing in WA is like a De Grey in terms of a bulk tonnage style mineralisation, or Havieron, which now is owned by Greatland Gold. They're not common here, so therefore investors aren't really familiar with them, so they don't really know how to interpret results like 200 or 300 metres at 1 to 2.5 gram gold equivalent. So they're kind of like, what does that mean? Sounds a bit low grade. And then they see the gold equivalent, which is because these deposits are polymetallic, predominantly gold and copper. And they kind of think, what does gold equivalent mean? And then they got to look at the fine print and see what the calculation says and try and work it out. And then they go, what's the metallurgy on that look like? And it just sort of creates a bit of confusion or doubt. And so it's very easy, I think, if you're an investor that has a minimal amount of time when you're assessing investment opportunities. If there's something you don't really understand, it's human nature to kind of, I'm not going to, out of these 10 that I want to read today, I'm not going to read that one because I don't get it. Which is interesting in itself. If you I do a lot of marketing globally, particularly North America, and it's the opposite over there. North American investors understand these sorts of assets because if you look at, for example, the TSX, every second Canadian junior has exposure to some kind of porphyry project, whether that be in Canada or South America. And so those investors understand these assets a lot better. And it's been interesting over the last few months when we look at the trading in Strickland, a lot of the buying and new investors that we're seeing are out of North America, because they understand these assets.
Yeah, it's a fascination because the company being so traditionally in the Western Australia, and then this coming on board, a lot of them would have been like, I don't really understand what quite's happening, but if it's gold, at least it's filling that bucket for them. But simultaneously, a lot of the focus when we talked was all on Serbia and these projects and prospects, but there's still the WA project within the ecosystem. I can imagine a few investors are maybe there because of that project initially, and it's not out of the portfolio. But is there any updates on Yandal and what's sort of ongoing there? Because that was also part of the history of Northern Star's involvement, and then the project selling and all of that, which is, as you alluded to it earlier, has helped put Strickland in a very good cash position compared to other junior explorers or even mid-tier explorers.
Yeah, so obviously that asset is still in the portfolio, and we're still exploring it at the moment. I guess the thing I'd say, you're right, Strickland has a lot of shareholders that invested for exposure to that asset. And even though last year what we saw was a lot of the smaller investors in Strickland from sort of September, October onwards looked to exit their position in Strickland because they weren't overly comfortable with the fact that, our main focus was now Serbia, and, they'd all made a fairly decent profit off the back of the sale of Millrose and the share price growth that came with that. So, we did see a big turnover of the register last year. In fact, we actually turned over about 30% of the register, and that put us under a fair bit of pressure from October through to sort of February with a lot of that selling happening. But all the larger shareholders in Strickland who had been there for a long time off the back of Yandel, most of them stuck fat. So most of those shareholders are still there, and it's fair to say the Yandel is very close to their heart. It is a cracking project. In fact, there's not many WA junior held gold projects like it, where you've got 400,000 ounces starting at surface, trucking distance to a mill. And so that is still very close to our investors' heart. It's still a part of the Strickland story. We're exploring there at the moment. One of the key sort of breakthroughs we've had there over the last couple of months, off the back of some of Richard Pugh's work, who's the director that runs that project, is actually following a trip of his to Serbia, where we had a porphyry expert, Dr. David Cook from Codes in Tasmania. He's been helping us out in Serbia with our porphyry hunt. Richard was there during one of those trips, and they were looking at sort of the geochemical signatures of these systems. And when he came back, he thought, I might just have a look at some of the Yandel data, because there are quite a lot of intrusions around Yandel as well. And what he found was a really strong intrusion-related signature to some of the mineralisation in the north of the Yandal project up at dusk till dawn. And then when he had a look at the geophysics data sets around there, he noticed a lot of these big gravity lows, which when we had them reprocessed, looked like they're mapping these large intrusions up there. And so he sort of put two and two together and thought, well, maybe this part of Yandal, the dusk till dawn camp, is actually an intrusion-related system, not just your classic orogenic gold. And so we've been doing some work following up on that thesis over the last couple of months. We've been doing some extra gravity surveys. We've been doing a lot of alteration analysis, and hopefully we'll be able to release some results of that work over the next few weeks. But it's certainly coming up some pretty interesting results. And really probably the key takeaway from it is, dusk till dawn with only 100,000 ounces was kind of viewed as like, it's got bigger fish to fry. It's just small, but that 100,000 ounces sits within a few hundred metres of strike from the work Richard has done, and together with his team, it looks like that system might have about 7 kilometres of strike. And the only part that's been properly tested is a few hundred metres. So that bodes pretty well for the upside of Yandal. The other thing I would say about Yandal is, we turned the rigs off there, so I think it was around last September, and we pulled all the data together and we put out the resource update late March. But since we did that, inadvertently we probably sent a bit of a message to the market that, look, Rogozna is the focus going forward. And what that has done, it's meant a lot of other companies have approached us over the last few months saying, hey, what are you doing with Yandal? And these companies range from sort of large mid-tiers down to sort of cashed up shells. We've probably had about half a dozen approach us since November, December last year. So we're sort of working through that in the background. What does that look like going forward? We're not sure. There's a chance we may divest Yandal over time, but certainly we see a lot of inherent value in Yandal. Our investors love it, and the WA market loves it. So whichever way we go, I think it'll be well received.
Interesting. Yeah, that's the flip of the coin, isn't it? Is that if potentially the focus is shifted, that it's not necessarily completely gone and out of flavour. And to have those sorts of conversations be happening in the background, it does sort of bit of confidence on that area to an extent. And now that we're realistically flying through June, it's going to be the new financial year in Australia at least, but there's going to be a plethora of announcements and sort of news flow for investors. And as you said, a lot of it is educating and probably keeping up the awareness part of it is your job. But going forward, what really can investors expect coming from Serbia, Rogozna, up the other drill results and the likes and the plans to get this 10 million ounce resource up and about?
Well, as I said earlier, in the short term, we'll just have regular news flow. Generally, we would put out results every 2 weeks. So we are one of the most active explorers on the ASX. I think we're in the top 5 in terms of...
There's a way to measure that.
Yeah,
really.
Well, you just if you look at sort of who's doing all the work, we generally put out the most announcements. But even if you look at the 50,000 metre program we're doing in Serbia, in terms of what is on the record, I think that puts us in the top 5 for companies on the ASX, junior companies, in terms of just how much drilling we're doing.
Yeah.
As I said, going from 6 rigs to 8. So in the short term, a lot of drill results, and as we saw last year, this is the sort of project where most of the drill results are pretty good. The mineralisation style is very visual, so when we're drilling it, we know what we've got. And I don't usually go to Serbia and come back unhappy. Let's just say that. So a lot of drill results, at least 2 resource upgrades out of Serbia by, hopefully by the end of the year. One for Shanats, but the main one being Gradina. So that'll be a real, potentially a game changer for the project, but also, regardless, it should be a nice number. And then leading from that is, an initial scoping study. So, those resource updates will feed into, mining studies, which are ongoing at the moment. We've recently appointed a few really key people to help with that. Mark Mantle, running the engineering side of things. And, so we're doing, updated feasibility work in the background. So a lot of met test work ongoing at the moment. We've got full-on environmental baseline studies going on in Serbia, which, you don't really put an announcement out to the market with those results. They probably don't interest people too much, but it's an important part of the story, particularly where we are in Serbia. We've got to, make sure that we can demonstrate a really sustainable project through to development. So all of that work will feed into a scoping study, which we're aiming for December, and a little bit will depend on how much of these drill results at Gradina. If we keep getting it going closer to surface, we need to keep following that, right? So so there's some risk to the scoping study date in terms of, do we get it out in time for December? Well, that'll kind of be driven by, the results at Gradina. If we keep getting spectacular results as we go closer to surface, we'll just keep drilling and keep drilling until we get to a logical point where, all right, we'll cut it there. So, but that scoping study will be pretty important. A lot of investors, particularly large institutions, want to have a good understanding of what the economics look like. And whilst we're internally very confident of what the economics will look like, it's important to be able to show the market that within the realms of what can be reported with ASX and ASIC. And so that scoping study will be key. The other thing about the scoping study, which of these deposits is going to be the first cab off the rank. At the moment, it's looking like Shanats or Gradina. And so a bit more clarity around that, because they're both quite different in terms of Gradina would be a smaller, higher grade sort of play. When I say small, not overly small, 1 to 2 million tonnes, whereas Shanats could probably do 5 million tonnes. But, there's different capex associated with both of those. So it's important that we can start to communicate that to the market.
And do you find that is one of the biggest questions that investors keep asking you, is which one are you going to be prioritising or bringing potentially online first? And is that something that they're always asking? Yeah,
we get asked that a lot, naturally. And that's one of the aspects of the project that's quite unique. Like, you don't normally have the option. Like
100% agreed,
most projects, you've got one deposit. You might have some little small piddly satellite stuff nearby. Again, if we're talking classic sort of orogenic gold, you're talking about normally one main deposit. So, and it might start at surface. So that's just it. And then it's really a case of, is it a 1 or 2 million tonne per annum sort of project? So Rogozna is different. We got 4 deposits, ranging in size, ranging in metals mix. And, particularly with Shanats, like, you could do it 1 million tonne or you could do it 5 million tonne. Which one makes the most sense? And obviously there's capex, big capex or small capex. So, and that's one thing I think Australian investors kind of struggle with, like, that again, do not compute.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
very fair.
Not used to seeing that optionality. But again, that's what the majors want. Like, to be able to scale up. With the classic difference between our project and a porphyry, for example, is these porphyry deposits, the only way they work is sort of 5 or 10 plus million tonne per annum, $1 billion plus capex. Whereas what we've got, you could start at $200-300 million capex, and then scale up from there. And that's a real key differentiator between what we've got with these skarn-hosted deposits and your classic porphyry.
And that links it back in with, again, Zijin coming on board, because I alluded to it. Not many Australians would know who that or what that company is, but the scale of them, the fact that they've come on board, they're not in it for just a handful of ounces, they're in it for the big reward. And that's sort of a tick of approval in many remarks. If not all Australians know the name, they sure will do now. But there's a lot going on, and I always like to summarise in key points and takeaways. And I think for investors, how would you best outline the next 3 pieces of information or news that they should take away or expect in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I would say keep an eye out on those Gradina results, because as we put out more of those drill holes, I think the value of Gradina will become a lot clearer. at the moment, it's arguable if it's even factored into our market cap. At the moment, 300 million odd market cap with this high-grade gold deposit sitting there that's not in resource. So keep an eye out on those Gradina results, particularly as we get it shallower and closer to surface, because it's not often that you start getting a deposit that as you're drilling it closer to the surface. Most people go deeper, right?
It's the inverse.
We're doing the opposite. We're taking it shallower, and all the evidence we're seeing is it looks to get better as we get. I mean, it's already good, but as we're drilling it closer to surface, it's looking like it's getting better. And there's a geological reason for that, which I won't bother going into. But the one thing I'll say, if you look at the other deposits, Shanats and Medenovats, for example, the best parts of those deposits are the shallowest parts of those deposits. And that's where the deposits hit the base of the volcanics. So we're seeing the same thing at Gradina. So that's so keep an eye out for that. Number two, keep an eye out on Yandel. What do we do there over coming months? I think that should be pretty interesting. And then in over the sort of closer to 6 months plus, as we look to deliver that scoping study, I think when we deliver that, the people will start to go, the penny will drop as to why this project's valuable and why, as a company like Zijin, 60 billion market cap, bothered to put in
why they put the cash
some money into this instead of something else. It'll be pretty clear.
Yeah, it's very exciting, and I think even since we last spoke 9 months ago, there's been tremendous evolution and growth, and I can imagine being internal, this is really not an everyday sort of update, like this is what you bleed and you know about, but for everyone else coming on board, they're sort of seeing it and you get to take them down the path. But for those that are wanting to reach out, follow the company, get more news, they can invest by going to the ASX, of course, but how can they keep in contact with the company and see all these updates come to the market and follow it?
Yeah, so they're able to, if you go to the company website, you can contact us through that and also subscribe for the newsletters. Also, Nicholas Reid is our media contact, so he's pretty well known in WA, so you can reach out to him. And that's the easiest.
No, wicked. There's a lot going on. It's very exciting. As a shareholder, as I said at the beginning, I'm pretty happy. I'm just sort of sitting on it and seeing where this all goes. But I appreciate you taking the time to speak on the show again, Paul. And from the sounds of it, you'll have to come back before the end of the year to provide updates on all of these results, scoping studies, and a plethora of other, realistically, options that you've got in the can. But thanks for speaking on the show this morning.
Thanks for having us, Ben.
Thanks for listening to the Market Bull podcast. Please remember that the topics and stocks discussed in this podcast are not financial advice. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like, share, and follow. You can follow the Market Bull on all our socials and keep up to date with global market insights.